So why does this matter? And I think this matters for a number of reasons. I think that belief system created something really important. It made me deeply trusting, my family deeply trusting of spiritual authority. And one thing that I will say about spiritual authority and that type of culture that I came up in, that it is intergenerational. So for most of us, even if most of us that are, black, even if we're not in the church today, that residue still continues. You may be operating in this grooming type mentality and still not even be in the church, because we believe in trusting these systems without questioning these systems. And you are taught that. Your parents were taught that. Your parents were taught that as well. So a lot of this is bringing a culture of obedience and submissiveness, and not questioning authority into a larger spiritual platform where you're it's shark infested waters. And so it made me seek out mentorship from church leaders. And in this particular situation, the pastor who eventually became my pastor out of this organization was someone who was known to have his own history of being delivered from homosexuality. A former homosexual, someone who had supposedly been transformed by the power of God, completely transformed. And he was the evidence. His marriage was the evidence. His ability to have a flock of sheep was the evidence. So in many ways, he was positioned as someone who could mentor someone like me at the time, someone who can guide me spiritually, someone who can help me overcome, something the church told me was wrong with me. I was inherently flawed, born in sin, and all of these different things. And so the manifestation of my birth in sin was partly homosexuality, and we need to get rid of that. We can't have any of that in the church. And so looking back, now as an adult, I understand something differently. I understand so many things differently. There was never anything wrong with me. There was nothing wrong with my sexual orientation. There wasn't anything wrong with me then. There isn't anything wrong with me now. But as a teenager inside that theological system, I didn't know that yet. I didn't understand that yet. I just remembered that part of my identity being reprimanded by every adult figure in my life: family, aunts, uncles, cousins, mother, father, in some way, some attribute that they associated to homosexuality that I exhibited was reprimanded. And so I was tired of that. I was tired of a life of this being so focal, and I wanted to do something about it. And the church seemed to have the medicine that I thought would work. Something else I learned later was that, at one point later on, he told me something that stayed with me. He told me that he had actually noticed me before I even joined that church. And so if I joined that church in, 2003 at 16, he noticed me at my previous church. When I was still attending my previous church, I was around 15 or 16. At that time, still I was young. I didn't fully understand the significance of that statement back then, but now looking back, it's something that I can't ignore. It's something that haunts me. It tells me that he had a predatory gaze in my direction at a very young age. And it was under the guise of, no, I see something in that young man, but I need to help and support that young man. And so let's talk about how grooming actually begins. Here's something most people don't understand about grooming. It is rarely about, or it rarely begins with something sexual. I'll say it that much. It is not overtly sexual. It's not assuming in that way. It becomes emotionally positioning. That's what it is. It begins with emotional positioning. It eventually can become sexual. The groomer begins creating a dynamic where you feel chosen, And usually there is a targeted individual, but you got to get to that targeted individual. And so, whether that's family, friends, usually individuals like that, they have some levels of protection. Not all of them have protection. But in my case, I did have family there. But, the groomer recognizes that the family is a barrier. So I need to gain the trust of that family, in so much as they see me as essential to the development of that young man's life in ways that they can't contribute. They can't help him, but I can, and they need to turn over the authority to help him to me. And so essentially, the groomed individual, myself in that case, I wasn't the only one groomed. My family was, I'll say that. You feel chosen, you feel special, different from everyone else. You might hear things like you're more mature for your age, or you're very mature for your age. You're different. God has something special for you. You'll hear these kinds of things that you needed to hear. Somebody needed to tell you this in life, but not because they had nefarious intentions, right? God has something special for you in life, and when you're young, especially inside a spiritual environment, that kind of attention feels like validation. And at the time, I needed a whole lot of it, I'll be honest. The young person in me that was living life in a difficult life needed validation. Predators see that. But what he was actually doing was creating a psychological access. So I want to go ahead and show you a few things. I have so much evidence here, but I'm not showing you this I think receipts are needed, but I'm not to scandalize, but definitely to legitimize the situation at hand, or that happened. So this is one of the handwritten letters that I received. I want you to especially look at the tone, look at the language, look at the intimacy in the communication. This wasn't just casual church interaction. This was more than that. This was personal communication. It's handwritten, it's intentional, it is direct. It wasn't a one-time thing. There were multiple letters, folks, multiple love letters, or the progression of the tone and the communication in the letters. It gradually grew to something very inappropriate over time, but it was so ambiguous in the beginning, or very spiritual sounding in the beginning. So this was where he was kind of gauging where my head was, what kind of person he was dealing with, and how he was going to approach the grooming process with me, essentially. There were multiple exchanges, a pattern of communication over time. It wasn't just letters, like I said. There were also greeting cards. There were cards with handwritten messages inside them, cards that I kept for over 20 years. When you place those documents together on a timeline, very clear pattern has begun.